During an emergency, every second counts. Often healthcare workers and support staff are under pressure and required to work fast. MRC volunteers will be working with a large number of people in our community, which consist of a rich and diverse population. This video will explore the meaning behind cultural competency and examine the barriers that exist when dealing with a diverse population. We will hear from local Lehigh Valley health, wellness, and disaster response providers on how they deal with issues of cultural competency and what they have learned throughout their careers.
Cultural competency means to me, as a provider and for healthcare networks, being open to, aware of, and then looking to acquire the skills to be responsive to a patient regarding all of their beliefs, their attitudes, their styles, their behaviors, all of the things that go into the person that they are. And a lot of people think it's all about culture and ethnicity, but it goes beyond that to poverty level, socioeconomic status, gender, sexual preference, just everything that makes up who the person is and the networks that they socialize in, and being able to provide care in a way that's going to be meaningful to them.
I think cultural competency means to me the ability to understand the differences between cultures, to be able to work with people, and to have an understanding of how we, in my case as Red Cross, can help you.
According to the American Medical Student Association, the 4 goals of becoming more culturally competent include cultural awareness, appreciating and accepting differences; cultural knowledge, the process of deliberately seeking out various worldviews and explanatory models of disease to aid in the promotion and understanding of illness and treatment between cultures; cultural skill, learning how to assess a patient without relying on written facts, explaining an issue from another's perspective and recognizing defensiveness, and acknowledging interactive mistakes that hinder the desire to communicate; cultural encounters, meeting and working with people of a different culture to help dispel stereotypes and remain open to the individuality of each patient. These goals serve as a guide to delivering culturally appropriate interventions in medical care. In order to attain our goals of becoming more culturally sensitive, we must also look at barriers that exist and how we can overcome them.
One of the first barriers we face is historical distrust. Certain cultures have experienced many past and present social injustices. These past experiences may color their perception about healthcare providers and impede their ability to have more open and honest rapport with the providers trying to care for them.
We'll have, let's say, for instance, a fire outside of town. Maybe it'll be an apartment or maybe a rooming house. Within the city, it's known that maybe there are people there who are illegal. We'll come on the scene to assist people who have had the fire, and that means that the Red Cross will assist everyone. We're totally neutral, but yet these people are fearful of coming out, and yet they need the help the most because they have so little. So what we'll generally do is, when we're on the scene, we certainly have translators, but we will, have our translators go out into the crowd and talk to people and let them know that the Red Cross is here to help them, that we have no lines as far as the police or, authorities, and that we're here only to help. And generally what will happen is the police will go away and we'll stick around, and eventually you'll see 2 or 3 people coming out, and they'll tell you that, they're either here illegally or they were worried because, they didn't want their names to be associated.
One of the problems we run into with the clinical care that we provide is that we are trying to work with minority populations, get them connected to insurance. They get scared that when we're asking them for information that we're going to report them or try to get them deported, and that trust factor really creates problems. And so we have to focus very strongly on working with them and gaining their trust and having them understand that we are trying to help them, getting them connected to insurance so we can get them the medicines that they need, get them the specialty care that they need, and that we have no intentions of causing them any harm.
Cultural competency involves more than just cultures defined by a region or country. They also include communities such as the disabled and/or the interpretation of disabled. Some populations with physical or mental limitations may resent being lumped into a category of disabled, and in fact may not view themselves as having a disability at all.
Some cultures, I've seen that some disabilities, they are perceived as stigma, and people are not willing to accept them. They think that it's they're just not ready to accept those disabilities. I have a very good example. In fact, one of my patients who is now 17, and he was, I think he's from Lebanon, and so there was an American couple who went as a tourist to Lebanon, and it was interesting that they found that this kid was 6 years old at that time who had cerebral palsy, and he was abandoned by his family, and he was on the street, basically, just left alone because the family could not take care of him, and they just didn't want him to be with them. Whereas this couple who was from United States, they were, because to them disability was not perceived as a stigma, they actually adopted this kid, and now he's 17 here. He underwent many surgeries and good medical care. He's graduating from school, and every time I see him, it's very rewarding to watch the whole process. So I think the disabilities, people perceive them differently among different cultures.
I think the interpretation of disability within a cultural competency perspective requires you thinking about both the provider side and the patient side. I can't tell you how many times I've witnessed providers who assume that because somebody has a physical disability that maybe they're mentally challenged too, and they start talking to them in condescending ways, or they ignore them and turn to the person that's with them and start talking to that person as if this person isn't competent enough to talk about their issues themselves. And so I think it's really important that providers get to really understand the disability you're dealing with and recognize that just because someone may have a speech impediment or be in a wheelchair, that does not mean that they can't participate fully in their care.
A common barrier among people of different cultures involves linguistic misunderstandings and communication styles. Different cultures communicate in very different ways, both verbally and non-verbally.
I have, even with Hispanics, I have encountered barriers in vocabulary. What something might mean in Puerto Rico might be different in Mexico. It might be different in South or Central America. So I have encountered, those issues.
Oftentimes we think about cultural competency simply as a language issue, and it is so much more. When we look at patients who come from different cultures, they have different ways of expressing themselves, even if they're speaking in English.
Some of the nonverbal communication patterns that I have really needed to spend some time learning about and trying to understand, one particular aspect is eye contact. I've learned that some of the minority cultures, they actually consider it rude to make eye contact with you, where in my culture it's sometimes considered rude not to make eye contact, so there is a discrepancy there. I've learned that for many different cultures that's a problem.
During an emergency, patient care will happen at a rapid pace. Every effort will be made to plan and prepare for limited English proficiency persons. However, we must also prepare for the fact that our resources may be scarce or non-existent. In order to appropriately care for LEP persons, we must consider making preparations ahead of time and identify those who can offer translation services in a culturally appropriate way.
Because you have to think about it, and you have to identify how you're going to communicate with them and still respect their need to communicate clearly. Having been trained in the medical interpretation area, I know how important it is to be able to facilitate that. And so we're lucky that we have access to the language line if they're for those special languages that we can't do in person with a bilingual provider. And then that kind of really helps, I think, break down any barriers. And a recent one, the family was able to speak through the interpreter, and by the end of it we were all joking around because he was talking about how he gets dizzy sometimes, and he thought I meant because he was drinking. And then when we clarified it all, he said, no, sometimes I just get dizzy because I don't eat.
If you already know ahead of time, and usually you should have an idea of that. If you already know ahead of time the kinds of instructions or the kinds of directives or the kinds of actions you're going to be taking, then have those directions translated in the language ahead of time, so that so you're not caught off guard. And when you do that, it's always helpful to have a network of translators, to help you ad hoc, but as well in the planning development of any of those policies and procedures, so that you can anticipate the subtleties of resistance, as well as make sure you know the right tone and the right approach to be helping that person. So disasters, some of it can be anticipated and some of it can be prepped for, and that's probably the best prevention, the best defense you can have.
During an emergency, resources may be scarce. However, every effort should be made to have an appropriate person translate this very important and crucial health information. Other strategies for providing culturally linguistic care include: speak directly to the patient and not to the interpreter, maintaining a comfortable personal space, offer information or health literature and consent forms in their native language if possible. Otherwise, offer assistance with translating those documents. If you have access to a language line, use that service if an appropriate interpreter is not available. Avoid using a family member, especially a child, to translate, unless it is the preference of the patient and that person has demonstrated proficiency in using specialized terminology.
Through the medical interpretation stuff that, the training that we did through Bridging the Gap, they really talk about you are really just the conduit. I mean, that's the main purpose of interpretations and interpreters, is just serving a conduit between the healthcare provider and the patient, so that you almost become invisible, and you should almost become invisible, and you're speaking in the first tense, so that really the patient and the provider is having this direct one-on-one conversation. It gets a little uncomfortable for the interpreters because a lot of times people are used to that summarization type of interpretation, and that really kind of demeans, or it breaks down the communication, so that the art of medical interpretation really allows the patient to say exactly what they want to say to the doctor, and allows the doctor, nurse practitioner, the nurse to say exactly what they want to say back.
Different cultures have different ways of explaining illness and disease. Western medicine should be more cognizant of the fact that this may be incompatible with the way other world cultures view their health issues.
In a lot of the Spanish-speaking countries, it's considered to be a gift from God. Okay, so naturally when you get ill, what do? You pray, you make offerings, you do penance, you have your shrines in your home that you pray to a certain saint from the Catholic Church, or you do the rosary, and prayer is the healer in some cases. The other, the disasters are, in many societies are considered, Spanish-speaking communities are considered to be the wrath of God, because that community or that society has been doing something against the belief of the church.
Another item that is a big stigma is, mental health, mental illness. And there are many ways that people explain it away. Usually, that they have inherited it from a previous life, or somebody in their family did something wrong, and that's how, how somebody has to bear the burden of that wrong. But also, in some situation, it's like a mental illness can also be viewed as a gift. It is that you are different, and that you had certain powers, and that that specific situation that you were put on, made you more or less as if you were chosen for a better mission.
Another potential barrier to culturally competent care involves the provider's understanding of different cultures' family identity structure. It is important to note that the family often extends beyond the sphere of the traditional nuclear family and community.
So it's different. Like I had a Asian father whose son was having hemorrhoids, and he was bleeding, and the father, obviously you have to do good thorough exam, but the father wanted to be there. So the staff was very, people were just shocked because they were like, what's going on in this family? Why does the father want to be involved in all this? But I guess culturally that's very acceptable, and the son didn't have any issues, and the father was there all the time, and he did that. He made the decisions on behalf of his 22 years old son. So I had another patient who's again Asian. The girl, whenever she comes through any exams, the mother would like to be with her all the time. And I've seen that, with staff, they always get very uncomfortable, and there's always, these little ideas, and people talk about it. What's wrong with this lady? She's very, she's very controlling, but again, that's the cultural norm. That's how people deal with it.
Sometimes we'll see, especially in some of our families in the Lehigh Valley, where there are many decision makers within a family. It often occurs when you have families with very large numbers of people and very large extended families, all of whom feel very close with a patient. This is very true not only among our Latino patients, but also our patients of Arabic descent as well. So when a patient comes in, you're not only dealing with one relative or two relatives, but several relatives who all have their own feelings and their own thoughts about how we should be caring for the individual patient. It's very important that we identify one spokesperson for the family so that we can best accomplish care and keep the family informed. But oftentimes this is a very big challenge for families who might have very different opinions on how we should care for their family members. And a lot of times this is related to how much acculturation has gone on with the family, how long they've been in the United States, and how long they've been exposed to Western culture.
I think with any disaster, with any situation, whether it's bioterrorism, natural disaster, an outbreak of an illness, family togetherness is key. And I think that's very important for any culture, but particularly because the Hispanic community tries to stay together. It is important always to maintain that family together. The Latino community is very sensitive towards the needs of the elderly and the children. So you want to take care of those two groups first.
These are just some of the major barriers to culturally competent care. It is also important to note that specific subgroups within the population may be more at risk of suffering adverse outcomes post-disasters. These groups include children, women, persons with disabilities, minorities, immigrants, refugees, the poor, the mentally ill, the bereaved, and those that require medical or surgical intervention, intense or prolonged exposure to the event, and those with pre-existing stress disorders.
It's very important to understand culture, or the impact of culture on the care of patients, and to have some kind of organization for yourself to put it into place. And the one I like to use talks about a staircase approach to culture. At the most basic level, we have something called cultural destructiveness. And that often occurs when a patient comes in from a different culture, and providers will say things like, well, why can't that patient speak English? Or why is that patient even using our healthcare system? And that's just destructive. That serves no purpose in a healthcare setting. And oftentimes that can be very harmful, not only for the patients that are from the other culture, but for all patients that are seen in the institution. Next is a step called cultural incapacity, which is very similar to the destructiveness, but the intent is different. The intent is not harmful, just not having the capacity by which to understand these types of differences with patients. We next come to a level called cultural blindness. And on the surface, this might seem like a good thing, that we treat every culture in a blind fashion. In fact, it can be harmful. So for instance, when we choose to treat patients all the same, we don't look for any differences with patients, we're actually doing our patients a disservice. When we don't look for those aspects of care, aspects of culture that really define individuals and define cultures, we're treating everyone just the same. We're actually not meeting their needs as patients, nor are we meeting our needs as providers. There's a concept called culture precompetence, which is a state where you understand the need to become more culturally competent, to understand culture a little bit more, but haven't really been able to overcome some of the initial barriers. So you understand the need to become more culturally competent, to investigate culture more, but you haven't really gotten to that point yet where you're able to treat patients in a culturally competent way. Next comes cultural competence, which is that state where you are able to treat patients uniquely. You're able to treat patients for their diseases based on what's important to them. You're able to treat patients in a culturally competent manner, sensitive to their culture and cultural needs. Finally is a state called cultural proficiency. When you become culturally proficient, you're able to integrate all aspects of culture, all aspects of individual into a patient's care. This is the epitome of patient-centered care, something that we strive for in medicine, but is only attainable by a select few.
Cultural competency is a long and ongoing process that will involve your own self-awareness, acceptance of others' worldviews, and the ability to learn, respect, and determine the appropriate actions for individuals and community groups.
I think the most important for first responders is to not make any assumptions. It's very easy when you go into certain areas of town to make an assumption. And 9 times out of 10, you're going to be wrong about that assumption. So I think we should go in as open and willing to understand that we are there to help, that we ask questions because that enables us to help, but not questions with an attitude or accusingly so.
The best way to become culturally aware is to really immerse yourself in the culture. Really speak with people from the other culture and really inquire of them what it is about their culture and their cultural beliefs that makes them different, that makes them unique. Really approaching each patient as a learning opportunity for yourself as a provider so that you can then take the learnings and move on to the next patient down the road, because in the end we're caring for communities one individual at a time.
The best ways to improve your cultural competency skills are to seek out interactions with different cultural groups. This will allow you to learn more about the commonalities among these cultural groups, as well as determine individual and unique characteristics. In-depth training courses are also a good way to learn more about cultural competency.
Well, I think you can get a lot of information off of some of the internet websites. The Office of Minority Health has been a site that I have repeatedly visited to learn more about minority health disparities, cultural issues, wealth of information.
Training plays a very important part for us. I know for myself, the study of different cultures, the fact that my job requires that I deal with the different cultures, acknowledging the different cultures that we have here in the Lehigh Valley, and affording myself an opportunity when I can to work among these folks, and a lot of times being asked to come in and talk about what the Red Cross does. And I just think that we need to reach out more and understand that this is a very diverse world, and that we as Americans sometimes get so caught up with being Americans that we forget that there are hundreds of cultures and languages, and what a wonder that we can learn so much from them.
Emergency situations will most certainly involve psychological and physical trauma. It is our job as disaster responders to provide emergent, non-judgmental, and culturally sensitive care. As a human race, we all suffer, we all strive, we all love. We may just express these feelings in a slightly different way. Recognize our similarities and differences, and value diversity as a strength. Understanding others' perspectives is essential to building an effective Medical Reserve Corps response team.
putting down all the prejudices and, you know, the fixed ideas. It's really a matter of, you know, what you feel is right to deal with a person as another human being. And that is a universal language, and that's probably what is going to reach out to a lot more people with a lot more effectiveness than, you know, learning a language or knowing the right idioms, etc.
For more information on cultural competency, please check out these websites.